Hey there, everyone. Today I'm going to be reading a paper for you that I wrote for my feminist philosophy class. This was concluding our first 2 units on oppression and gender, and all the quotes can be found in Feminist Theory, a Philosophical Anthology, edited by Anne E. Cudd and Robin O. Andresen, published in 2005 by Blackwell Philosophy Anthologies. I hope you enjoy. Feminism, like any discipline worth talking about, is plagued with the somewhat paradoxical problem of defining its own object of analysis. After all, to be a feminist is to engage in the process of the betterment of society for women, a category of people who have long been systematically oppressed by society, defined into a role of submission, passivity, and receptivity to men. But this project begs the question, what is it to be a woman? While many feminists have found it necessary to define the feminist subject in order that she may be able to be fought for more concretely, her outline being clearly delineated, this attempt at grounding feminist theory and praxis in a concrete subject is problematic. To define what it is to be a woman is an inherently ungroundable project, since any usage of the concept of woman depends upon pre-theoretical assumptions about what kinds of entities are to be marked as women, therefore begging the very question of womanhood in its deployment. Using the work of Judith Butler and Louise Antony, this paper will provide an overview of the complications inherent in the project of defining women and the exclusion it entails. To define any identity category is to be faced with a twofold task: grounding it in something endurable, stable, and articulable, the kind of thing anyone could agree upon after a mere glance at what would seem the unquestionably brute reality, while at the same time recognizing the normative nature of the values we subjectively hold as members of a group, the bindingness of which very well might not be universal or even intended to be so. In Louise Antony's Natures and Norms, she explains this dilemma as one between external and internal accounts of human nature, the identity category she's concerned with investigating in her paper. External accounts of human nature, she says, are those that depend upon the appraising perspective of a neutral observer who has no knowledge of nor any commitment to human practices or values. Since such a perspective will lack the biases of us humans, who remain absorbed in our own values and definitions, it will be prized for its claims to verifiability and objectivity. After all, if we can simply observe a list of facts, we can then tabulate and synthesize them into a coherent account of the way things are, which will be free of error. Well, not so fast. For, as Antony recognizes, such an account will falter due to its lack of normativity. It will not be able to generate reasons for accepting ethical propositions about what human beings should or should not do. A la David Hume's is-ought distinction, we know that empirical facts alone about what is cannot yield ought statements, since these two categories are ontologically distinct. External explanations lack the ability to provide a ground or explanation for our normative claims to representation and/or the liberation of women. While it has the universal sway of incontrovertible facts, it lacks the ability to adequately unearth the means by which we come to the notions of women we do. If we want our external accounts to be normatively binding, we must also take into account internal conceptions of human nature, and by extension, womanhood. As Antony explains, internal accounts are those drawing explicitly on the norms and values embodied in human practices, using human beings' own judgments about what makes their lives human. As Antony recognizes, to talk about what is requires a consideration of who is determining the conditions and terms upon which such a judgment is reached. It requires not only the recognition of facts, but also questions of worth. As such, to find a normative basis for arguments from human nature, which would thereby argue for people changing their actions in accordance with this recognition of the definition of this identity category, we must take into account the group that is making the appraisal, as well as the terms, beliefs, and values upon which such an appraisal is based. Already we can see that our attempt to ground identity in incontrovertible facts has grown a bit more dubious. Not only must we have a method and capacity for examining the facts of the world, but we must maintain an eye for who is making such an examination, and their subjective beliefs and values. Antony continues in her paper by examining the scientific attempt to ground human nature in the human genome, an analysis which we will find serves our analysis here greatly. For, as Antony recognizes, such an investigation reaches a question-begging conclusion when we are faced with the continuum of genetic information of a variety of organisms and asked, which of these are human? At such a moment, one is faced with the fact that any boundaries placed amidst this continuum to delineate a clearly distinct, wholly exhaustive identity are immediately recognized as arbitrary. Most significant for our purposes, Antony writes that if there is any sense to be made of the notion of the human genome, it must be done by generalizing over and abstracting from the genotypes of individuals antecedently identified as human. In other words, any attempt to identify in order to be universal and exhaustive depends upon our already existing conception of that identity, which smooths over the gaps and, more importantly, the ambiguities at the interstices of that identity category. For, as anyone who has spent any time investigating the natural sciences knows, definitions of the natural world are always preliminary, and plentiful exceptions to our human rules abound. The attempt to ground human nature here is shown to be dependent upon our list of facts being subjected to the appraisal of agents who impose their pre-theoretical assumptions upon these facts, in order to determine strict boundaries between the otherwise ambiguous continuum of information. And indeed, the same applies to the concept of women. Just as the natural scientists do, feminists would like to ground the concept of women in something immutable, unchanged by the appraising party, yet maintaining the normative sway of, you should be natural, for natural is good, and to go against one's nature is bad for you. But just the same, feminists are faced with the problem of our thrownness into and amidst our conceptions of womanhood. To adequately understand the concept of women cannot be done by abstracting away from the subjective standards and perspectives that allow us to come to these categories in the first place. Rather, we must recognize that any category of identity depends upon pre-theoretical assumptions imposed by a particular group that is defining the subject of analysis. As I would like to make clear, such a project of identifying and defining woman is in fact an act of imposition, hence identifying, of a particular group upon a group which thereby imposes an essentializing conception of identity. Such is in fact the primary point of Judith Butler's work in Subjects of Sex, Gender, Desire, where she problematizes the notion of there being a subject of feminism. As she states, the domains of political and linguistic representation set out in advance the criterion by which subjects themselves are formed, with the result that representation is extended only to those who can be acknowledged as a subject. Subjectivity is here seen as a legitimizing marker procured for those who fall in line with the pre-theoretically reached domain of women. By meeting these pre-theoretical criteria, womanhood is bestowed upon or extended to those subjects who have already been antecedently identified as acceptable subjects of this discourse. Thus, the whole process of defining identity is discourse relative and has the appearance of a mere farce, doing a great deal of theoretical work just to reach a question-begging and, as Butler argues, exclusionary notion of the subject, woman. Gender is seen by Butler as a legitimizing category, and one among many, that serves the larger political project of constructing in and out groups who are legitimated by and begged in their identity by the very discourse they depend upon for their notion of identity. Such a circular conception of identity is essential to what it means to be a social being, as we humans are, who are intimately and inextricably tied to and thrown into our world. To attempt to achieve an unbiased, universalizing conception of identity is to sanitize humans of the very sociality that makes us the kind of entities we are. Instead of assuming womanhood is adequately understood as an essential state of being or a collection of properties and capacities that could even in principle be given an exhaustive philosophical account, Butler's work helps shed light on the fluid and intersectional nature of identity, highlighting how gender is not always, we might say rarely if ever, constituted coherently or consistently in different historical contexts, since it is part of the interconnected web of the social. As such, Butler argues that we free feminist theory from the necessity of having to construct a single or abiding ground which is invariably contested by those identity positions or anti-identity positions that it invariably excludes. Instead of assuming such a rationalistic, totalizing, and essentializing conception of identity, which depends upon exclusion as the dialectical double of inclusion, Butler's project pushes us to the conclusion that what it is to be a woman is in fact not the kind of question which can be adequately answered by providing a set of properties or qualities, or a lived experience. Rather, it will and must be answered by preferring many different and indeed irreconcilable identity conceptions grounded in a multiplicity of properties, qualities, and lived experiences who must find a coalitional and liminal way to coexist productively. However, such a conclusion is often met with the charge of obfuscating the question of womanhood to the detriment of women and their incontrovertibly present oppression. Now, this is indeed an important critique, since the very need to ground feminist theory in a conception of woman is part of the larger liberatory and representative project of feminism, and could be argued that Antony and especially Butler's conclusions threaten feminism's political project at its very core. Now, in some sense, this is correct. Feminism can and will never reach a moment where we will have reached a state of zero oppression. For such a utopian future would entail us humans' divorce from the legitimating frameworks of identity so central to what it means to be human: social, interconnected, ambiguous, strife-inducing, and competitive, etc. And Antony and Butler's conclusions help to rid us of this naive version of feminism. But in a much more nuanced and important sense, neither Antony nor Butler's conclusions prevent us from doing the kind of real-world work that feminism works towards and demands, liberating those entities who appraise themselves to be women from the kinds of maladaptive forms of mistreatment identified as oppressive and deemed undesirable by those aforementioned women. While I can willingly concede to my hypothetical critic here that such a notion of women implicit in this liberatory project is, by Antony and Butler's conclusions, unable to be firmly and conclusively delimited, I can still pragmatically and with good reason maintain that these theorists' liminal and fluid conception of identity can still serve feminist goals of freeing the oppressed. For all that these conclusions entail is that we recognize that the appraisal of oppression, as well as the ethico-political demand that such oppression be ameliorated, is inextricably tied to a group that feels oppressed. As far as my argument here is concerned, it seems clear that this does not forestall our ability to recognize and acknowledge oppression and therefore ameliorate it, but rather places the theoretical onus on oppressed groups to articulate to their fellow human beings or members of smaller societal groups such as neighborhoods, cities, households, or countries that they share in this social act of perpetuating oppressive behavior which their fellow humans view as disadvantageous. By encouraging this interdialogic project, recognition and acknowledgement of oppression and its maladaptive effects can be readily conceded by fellow group members who can be convinced to participate in a feminist project. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting and helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, German idealism, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just like to donate one time to the channel, because it really helps take some pressure off me and get the materials I need to make these kind of videos, but no pressure. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.